Hello, my name is Adriana and welcome back to my YouTube channel. So we are on part 2 of this Austin yogurt shop episode. We talked about the case, what happened that night of December 6th of 1991 when 14 girls were murdered and set afire in the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt shop. What we know, like we discussed in the previous video, was that all 4 girls were shot in the back of the head with a .22 caliber gun, and that Amy Ayers was actually shot twice with a .380 caliber gun. So we know that 2 guns were involved. We also know that there were 2 unknown men left in the building that were super mysterious to many people, that were the last men to see these girls alive. It is also known that firemen were first to the scene and washed away so much evidence will soon hinder this case, and you'll find out how. We also know that the fire arson report might have been misleading to begin with, and then 8 years later is determined otherwise. Which one is true is not sure. I don't know if you had a lot of questions in the last episode, but I did. I wanted to know, like, the shops next door, was anyone there? Who are these 2 men? Is there anything else we know? To answer the first question, was anyone next door? Did anyone not hear these girls possibly screaming or the gunshots? Why did no one report to the police? Well, actually there was someone next door at the neighboring store. I believe it's like a party store. Apparently he never hears the bullets, or he does and just didn't think anything of it. But strangely, he's one of the first people to smell the fire, and he actually isn't the person to report the fire. It's a cop that sees it. So I don't know, that just makes me super frustrated, because I don't know how you wouldn't hear anything. I don't know. As for those 2 males that were making everyone feel super uncomfortable, no idea who they are. To this day, no one knows who those 2 unidentifiable men are, not even the people who felt suspicious about them. To begin the investigation, the lead investigator, John Jones, if I'm correct, orders for the girls' rooms to be investigated, hopefully finding maybe drugs, leads, terrible relationships, just anything that could possibly give reason to why these girls were murdered. However, he ends up with nothing. The girls are innocent, they're squeaky clean, there is no motive that they know of. Like we discussed before, all the evidence is washed away, but we do know a few things, and I'm going to read the list of the 12 pieces of evidence that are discussed in the book, Who Murders These Girls, and the citation is down below. So the first evidence list states that they know how and where the fire started, which we discussed might be misleading. That there's a key. The key is in the front door. How much money was taken, which we discussed was $440 or more. How the girls were arranged, which we discussed before as well. What was used to bind the girls, which were their clothing. That the office was not entered, which becomes important later in false confessions. That the office key was still under the register. The 2 caliber of weapons used, .22 and .380. There were actually 2 pairs of underwear missing from the crime scene. Earlier, Amy had been wearing a bomber jacket but didn't have it, or it was not discovered in the crime scene. I don't know if maybe it's possible that it burned, but it's just missing. Amy has a bruise on her chin due to some sort of trauma. They also know that at some point Amy was strangled, and they know what she was strangled with after her autopsy. Like discussed before, we know that Amy was shot with 2 guns and not 1 like the other victims. So that was basically the initial evidence that they have. However, that list frequently changes throughout the entire investigation. So there are so many suspects that are looked into, hundreds and hundreds of people. There are also so many false confessions that come in, which also mislead this investigation for years, and it's just super frustrating. 8 days after December 6th, the night of the murders, Maurice Pearce is actually arrested at the mall that Amy and Sarah had been at that same night. He is arrested and found with a loaded .22 caliber gun. Now, hopefully you recall that one of the weapons used on the girls happened to be a .22 caliber. Apparently, Maurice Pearce had actually made jokes to his friend Forrest Wellborn that he had used that weapon in the murders. Although finding out this information, the interrogation basically just doesn't pan out and the ballistics just don't match up with the girls, so they release him and that's passed over. This was like the first time that Austin ever experienced anything like this. It was not normal at this time for a 4-person murder to take place. I'm sure one of the questions you're asking is, why were these girls alone at night? Was there no manager? Was there no security? Was there nothing like that? Well, that also goes into the fact that at this time it really wasn't that crazy for these girls to be alone, because it wasn't a normal dangerous thing. There were kids that snuck out and nothing happened to them because things like this just never happened. But still, I don't get it. I don't get how they could have been alone at that night, but they were. Details eventually keep just coming out that were once private and not let out because they were seeing it as a murder investigation, that now help other false confessions. So now people know that Amy was shot twice in the head. They know what weapon it was. They know where her body was. So they're spilling these details that later would actually help investigators know if they were truly the criminal, because only they would know the details. However, now all of Austin knows the details. So this is really hard to pinpoint who could possibly truly be the murderer and who is not telling the truth. The original investigators eventually get promoted or taken off the case, and the case ends up with new investigators. And since Austin is learning more and more about the case, the city feels the need to kind of take it into their own hands, and constantly tips are coming in about literally anything. There's a boy wearing an army jacket, and so he must have been that unknown army man, because they put out a reward for it if there were any like information, and it actually, I feel like, kind of tosses and turns the case to where they're just getting so much information they can't even process any of what they're being told or piece it together. So I think that kind of makes it even worse. With the investigation now in new hands, they decide to go ahead and look at every single one of the old leads and choose for some reason to dig deeper into the arrest of Maurice Pearce and his 3 other friends. These 3 other friends are Forrest Wellborn, Robert Springsteen, and Michael Scott. Michael Scott is brought into interrogation, and he is actually pretty firm on the fact that he is innocent. He really does not give in, but after 11 hours of very long and intense interrogation, he admits and confesses. And he actually only confesses to basically choosing to rob the store and killing the girls. After getting this little piece of information, the police dig further and further and further and press into Michael. And eventually he just gives more and more details about what he did, who was involved, and he lists the other 3 males. However, how they go about getting this information from him is just not right. Here is a clip of kind of how the interrogation goes, and you can kind of make a opinion of your own of like how this just does not seem right at all.
Do that thing? Well, you're already there. You've already dug the hole. The hole's there.
Oh, then I'm in it. I don't know. That's what I keep telling you guys. I mean, my God, this was 7 years ago.
But this is one of the most significant things that ever happened in your life.
That's what I keep trying to explain to you. If I was there and I partook in this, I would remember these things.
And you do remember these things.
No, I don't. No, I do not.
You're the coldest guy I've ever talked to in my life. Are you a cold-blooded murderer?
No, sir, I'm not.
I think you are. I think Maurice is absolutely true about you.
Well, then
You're the coldest guy I've ever talked
we need
to.
to take.
Pardon me?
Then let's take whatever actions we need to take. If that's what you believe and that's where you think this case needs to go, then let's go there.
We don't want to go there.
But I'm doing everything I can and have exceeded my limits of helping you guys. Where do we go now?
So even though multiple times he says the wrong thing, he says that the girls are clothed and then that they're not, and that they were actually kicked and punched, but now they're not. He says so many wrong things, and just that clearly he's not the guy. But for some reason, they want to press on, and they actually give him information piece by piece then that they plant in his head to eventually admit. Like, there was a time, I believe, that they, like, for example, they're telling him, like, oh, you shot her with 2 bullets, even though maybe he actually didn't even say that in the previous time. He never mentioned it. And they're like, you said that, right? Even though he never did. So now it's planted in his head that he said it, and now he's gonna say that he did it. So although this confession basically should just be thrown out, they decide to believe it. They use the confession to go ahead and arrest the three other males. When Robert Springsteen is brought in for interrogation, he is also very firm on the fact that he is innocent, as you'll see here.
That brought back some memories, didn't it?
I remember looking at the gun.
You ever seen that gun before?
I'm not positive.
Does that look like a gun you've seen before?
It looks like a gun I've seen before, but I'm not positive.
After long and grueling hours of very intense interrogation, Robert Springsteen also confesses. His confession actually admits that he sexually assaulted Amy Ayers. When later asked why he admits this, if he was innocent, he explains how he just felt like he was being attacked and it was terrible, and he just felt like he had nowhere else to go. And you can kind of tell from this tape here with a weapon why these men might have actually admitted something that they didn't do.
I don't.
Is that the gun you walked up behind somebody with and shot in the head? Is that the one? Talk to me, Mike.
Yes.
You did that, didn't you?
Yes.
As for Forrest Wellborn, he never admits anything and remains on the fact that he is innocent. The same goes for Maurice Pearce. Also, I forgot to say that these confessions and arrests of all these 4 males actually happened 8 years later. 8 years after the 8 days that Maurice Pearce had been arrested in 1991. And at this time, all these males were from the ages of 17 to 15. So after about 2 years, so a decade after the murders have actually taken place, the trial for Robert Springsteen begins. His trial lasts about 3 weeks, and all of the family members are there. They truly believe that this is the man who killed their innocent little girls and just want him convicted. Unfortunately, Michael Scott's confession is used against Robert with his own confession. And these confessions are pretty hard not to believe. I mean, they say some things that only killers would know, but those ideas often were planted in the head of them. And I also understand from a jury standpoint how they could have believed them, because, I mean, why would you admit something you didn't do that could land you in this situation? Why would you admit to murder of 4 girls? But from a psychologist standpoint who actually goes in and looks at the interviews, he feels that he understands what happens to a human brain when they're under that much anxiety and stress. You feel like you're trapped and you want to get it out, and the only way out is to admit what the police want you to say. So after the 3 weeks have come to an end, the jury debates for a few hours and come to the conclusion that Robert Springsteen is guilty. Springsteen is then sentenced to the death penalty. A year later, Michael Scott's trial then takes place. He also is found guilty but is only sentenced to life in prison. As for Forrest Wellborn and Maurice Pearce, they are actually released. So Wellborn is released because he was never indicted, and then Maurice Pearce is released because the district attorney believes there is not enough evidence to use against him to convict him. The family is actually very devastated that these two men get away, but are happy that they at least got two of the murderers, or who they believe are the murderers. Maurice Pearce was actually killed a few years later. He ended up in an altercation with police officers after he had been pulled over for just a regular old traffic stop. He ended up stabbing an officer, and then he is ended up shot and killed. People like to say that the trauma and intense interrogation he experienced during his time with the yogurt shop case might have affected him in that moment, but who's to really say what happened? Both Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott appealed their case and eventually are overturned. And then they are allowed a retrial. They're allowed this retrial and get their convictions overturned because both of their confessions were used against one another. However, they never got to defend themselves against the other's confessions in court. So basically, Robert Springsteen never got to talk about his confession and Michael Scott's trial, and vice versa. So while we're waiting for this retrial to actually take place, DNA evidence is now possible because this is almost like 15 years after the murder, so technology has just gone so much further. So now there is DNA that they test to see if these two men or any of the four men that were initially arrested 8 years later could match. Surprisingly, and to shock everyone, what was supposed to be used to convict them better is actually doing the opposite. The DNA doesn't match any of the four men. They argue that this just means that there was a fifth guy, but that just doesn't make sense. Eventually, Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott are set free. Obviously, the families are super upset about this because, like I said before, they firmly believe that these were the two murderers. Robert Springsteen tried to get money, I believe like $720,000 he asked for being wrongly convicted. But because their case ends up in this weird spot with just law, he is not paid. Basically, they were convicted and they were set free, but they were never proven innocent. So it's kind of like this weird limbo that they're in. So because of that, they are never granted any payment. So he spent, I believe, 9 years in isolation and he gets no payment for it. I personally don't think that any of these men were guilty of this case. I do think that the interrogations were improperly gone about. I believe that they just wanted someone to blame, because it's just super frustrating that after years and years, there's nothing. I believe I get more frustrated because there were so many false confessions to begin with, and none of those were followed up upon, but because this kind of just fits the puzzle piece a little bit better, these guys are what are pursued. And there are actually a lot of questions about like what makes this false confession different from their false confession. I don't really know. There's just so many questions that unfortunately just will never be answered. Whether these guys were actually the murderers and get off, or they are not and there are still murderers just going about. Anyways, that's basically the entire case. We talked about what happened that night, how the trial investigation goes, and like I said, it is so frustrating because basically we have no answers. Unfortunately, to this day, we do not know who murdered Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thompson, and Amy Ayers. Anyways, thank you guys so much for listening to this. I have this out on Thursday, so that means I will have my next video up on Monday. It will be plant related. We'll be back in the groove of my plant loving life. Make sure you go ahead and comment, like, and subscribe wherever the buttons are to do that, because it does help me so much, and I want to say thank you so much for the support that I have received so far, and thank you for watching. Bye.